Hey folks, this is Andy Yost with the Center for Courts. I'm here with Judge Martinez Jones. Judge, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
We'll get started in just a few minutes. People will kind of trickle over from the video that they just watched. So we'll just hang tight, and in a couple of minutes, we'll get started. For the rest of you that are joining us or already have joined, we'd invite you to turn your cameras on. As always, this will be sort of an informal conversation with Judge Martinez Jones. So you're invited to hang out with us, have your camera on, talk with us. You can obviously use the chat. And I'll stop multiple times and invite questions from the group as well. So just give it a couple minutes here and then we'll get started. All right. So Judge, it looks like the participants that are joining us, this sort of slowed down a little bit. So I'm going to take that as a cue that we'll go ahead and get started, but I'm sure people will be popping in as we go. First of all, let me just thank you for joining us today for the Q&A session following your talk. I've listened to it while I was in coaching sessions, and I've listened to it before and again today, and I'm struck by a number of things that I'm hoping we get a chance to talk about today. But first of all, just thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
By way of logistics, let me just make a couple of quick comments for those of you that have joined. Again, first of all, you're welcome to join us with your cameras. We'd love to be able to see each other's faces, especially if you're going to have conversations with each other or with the judge. It's nice to just be able to put a face to a name. Welcome also to my colleagues from the Children's Bureau and from the Center for Courts, and some of you like Jess, who were once at the Center for Courts and now have made a lateral move over to the CIP. Nice to see you as well. We are recording today's session, so just know that that's the case. So if your cameras are on, if you'll just use your mute button when you're not talking, you can unmute yourself and just talk over me at any point. If you have a question and I'm rambling on and you want to just get a word in. You're also welcome to use the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat. If you have a question, you want to just shoot it in there. I can ask Judge Martinez Jones, you don't have to worry too much about the chat. If something comes in, I'll read it to you, so you don't have to balance too many spinning plates here as we go. And then lastly, if you have any tech issues during the Q&A session, Stephanie is on with us. You can just shoot a note into the chat to Stephanie and with NCJ/FCJ, and she'll get you sorted out. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. So Judge Martinez Jones, thanks again for joining us. My first question is kind of I would be a bad, late show interviewer. It's sort of a softball. My question is this. Having listened to your presentation again, what's the one big thing that you need all of us to walk away with, either thinking or knowing or doing after hearing your talk?
The one big thing I think is shifting our mindset in how we listen to children, and all families that come to our child welfare courts altogether. I know, especially as advocates and the lawyer types, we're always problem solving, right? And as a judge, it's always about credibility. But if we shift our mindset and start with the notion and the benefit of the doubt that what somebody is saying, especially a child, is their honest truth, then let's start there rather than poking holes in what they're saying and cross-examining, in a sense, whether or not they're accurate or if they misunderstood something, because oftentimes that is how we go about it. That's kind of the way our system is set up and built. And it is not a supportive way in which we work with children. If I have a kid telling me the kind of story that I talked about caseworker saying something inappropriate to a parent, and I said, well, is that really what you heard? Or do you think that your caseworker maybe was trying to help your mom? That kind of just turns the whole vibe. And that changes the relationship that I have with that child. And especially as the judge, the person responsible for a child, I really want that kid to trust me, but trust goes both ways. I've got to trust them and then they can trust me. And so that would be the one big takeaway, is if we can shift our mindsets and how we communicate and how we engage by starting off with the benefit of the doubt of believing, I think that we can get a lot farther, especially in the relationships that we have to make to do our jobs well.
Yeah, great. So one quick follow-up on that. And again, if anyone has any questions, just talk over me or type it in the chat. We'd love to hear from folks that are in the room. One question that strikes me, Judge, is I was listening to you speak again and during your talk and then just now in your comments, is I take you to be putting out there a pretty kind of nuanced and sophisticated idea of what it means to believe. So when I first started talking to you about this idea, I think I fell into the trap of like, oh, to believe someone means to assume that the facts that they're telling you are what actually happened in the world. And you're telling me that I need to listen with an inclination toward believing that. And as a lawyer, that obviously has a lot of problems for me. Right? Like I'm all about testing the veracity of what someone says and so on. But I think I'm starting to see, hopefully I'm starting to see that what you're actually positing is something significantly more sophisticated and nuanced than that. It's as though there's a question coming, I promise. It's as though you're saying it's less about what you're believing in terms of the facts here and more about the way in which you believe, right? The way that you take in what a youth client, for example, or a youth in your courtroom is saying. So it's not so much about believing facts, although in some cases that is what you're talking about, but it's sort of like believing the conviction or believing the sincerity of the speech or believing the truth of the experience that's being expressed.
Yes.
So my question is this: could you say a little bit more for the old version of me, the Andy that was a little reticent to accept this idea as a lawyer that I should listen to believe, and say a little bit more about the way of believing that you're describing or what it is you think I should be believing?
Yeah. And so when I was talking, I talked about, a child and any person really being the expert on their life, right? And we know that our kids, especially involved in the child welfare system, have gone through things. They've come from hard places. They've had experiences that we oftentimes wish kids would not have had. But that means that they are a human being moving through life with experiences, and that their truth is their truth. And so when they tell me something, especially as it relates to themselves and their life and what's going on in their world, I should believe their experience to be their truth. And when I pose what is the worst that can happen, and let's think about it from there, that's also talking to the lawyer, right? So let's talk about the facts. And we get really worried because abuse and neglect, outcries, those are facts that really drive what happens in our child welfare cases. But even if we believe that, right, we are not a system that just acts on a whim. We investigate, we ask collaterals questions, but we can start with believing the child, believing the experience, doing what we do when we hear whatever it is we hear. And in some instances, a child may just want to be heard, and that's it. And it's important to also, in some circumstances, ask if there is something that child wants you to take up on their behalf. Because I also think about this aspect in the lens of equity. And if we're talking about race equity, or we're talking about equity for our LGBTQ plus community, or we're talking about equity for any of our marginalized communities, and we think about children in the child welfare system as one of those communities, that is what works. You listen to believe their experience, let them tell you what they need in those circumstances in which you can. And I say that because of our mandated reporting statutes. I know there are circumstances where we have to act and do things regardless, but in the circumstances where we can, ask what is it that they want us to do. That, I think, is what gets us the kind of outcomes that are more healing and more helpful and less traumatic and less harmful.
Yeah. Man, there's a lot in there too. Thank you for that. That's a really eloquent response. It brings to mind this idea of kind of maybe a false dichotomy that some of us might have when it comes to this idea of listening to believe. The dichotomy maybe is something like this. Let's imagine that a child client is expressing in your language the truth of their experience in the form of a need. Hey, judge, what I need is this, or hey, attorney, what I need is this. On the one hand, and I'm not too proud to admit that this has been me on occasion. When I was a teacher too, I used to teach middle school and high school, same kind of trap I fell into. On the one side of the scale, there's this kind of patronizing attitude of like, or paternalistic maybe. You don't really need that. You think you need that, but you don't really need that. I know what you need and I'll help you get that. On the other side of the scale, or the other half of the dichotomy, is this kind of like utter deference, right? Whatever you need, I'll try to get, just anything, and I'll chase it down. But you're describing this, and I think this is where all the sort of the action is. This vast continuum, right, between these two things. What advice would you give an attorney, or a judge for that matter, who's trying to live in that gray area along that continuum? What kind of practical advice would you give us to work on our listening to believe skills?
So one, I think, again, it's a culture shift. I heard another judge in another presentation talking about, we don't say teams very often when we're talking about the child welfare system. Like, the people on this case are not a team because it's an adversarial system. But I do use team a lot, especially when I'm talking to the child, because when we're thinking about the center of our case, the center of our child welfare case, and especially the charge that I have in Texas, it's best interest of the child. And that's the language that we use. That I don't have anybody on my case generally who is actively working against the best interest of the child. Everybody has their own perspective of what's in the best interest of the child. And I know parents have an idea, and the attorneys for the parents are guided by their attorney's direction. But it all, in the end, is the best interest of the child. So when I talk to a child, I say your team. So when we talk about what does a child need, I'm not the only decision maker. We do still have parents usually, or we have our agency, our child welfare agency. I have a guardian for the child. I have a child's attorney. And so what I do, and usually, most of my kids know, but is have a conversation, right? So we have to make sure we're all speaking the same language. We have to make sure that we're making decisions in a guided way together, because I know I only have a piece of the information. And I take something like, a child said, I need this. And I'm not going to just say, yes, you get it, or no, you don't get it. I'm going to have a conversation with that child's team. So most of the kids in my court do know when they come to me with the request, they say, I know, you've got to talk to the team. I said, yes, I'm going to talk to the team. And I'll give you an example of why that's important. So I have a kid who asked me to get acting lessons and modeling lessons that cost $2,500. And I am one of those judges who will try and bend over backwards to get kids their wants, because I like to give kids what they want, but, fill their needs as well. But I know this kid is unique. He's got a little bit of a fixation on being famous. And so I wanted to be mindful. And he said, I know you're going to go talk to the team. I said, I am. So I convened a special review on that case. And we've been talking about some of the struggles that this child has and the best steps to take forward. And we have been working with a psychologist who did the evaluation for this child. And when we come up upon a question that we don't know the best choice for that child, we will consult with the psychologist. And so when we had this conversation, I said, I had a conversation with our kiddo, and he's continuing to talk about wanting to be famous, and said he's going to audition for The Voice. And then he's asked me for these $2,500 lessons. What does this team think? And everybody weighed in and Judge, are you going to order the agency to pay for that? That's a lot of money. All of those typical conversations. But we had parents actually who were involved in the conversation say, Judge, our kiddo has had, because this is an adoptive placement, and then we're back in the system and we're working with the family. So it's a whole complex thing. They said, Judge, this fixation on being famous has been something that's been happening ever since we adopted years and years ago. And so then I took a pause and said, well, maybe this means something more. I said, I think this is one of the things we should consult with a psychologist about. And we did. And the response we got is that this is rooted in something deeper. This is rooted in perhaps a dialogue this child is having about low self-esteem, and this need to be famous is going to fill this internal dialogue that he's been nurturing, but we shouldn't externally nurture it in the same way. And so we got guidance on how to do that. All that to say, we have to be smart, we have to be mindful, and we still have to be adults when it comes to decision-making about what children need. I am probably not the best to talk about what they want, because I like to give kids in care as much as I can. I see why not. Kids in general, you're only a child once and it goes by so fast. But when we start thinking about need and want and being cautious in the gray area about what is what, because a lot of people would have said he just wants these lessons. But this leads to some deeper need that we need to help satisfy. And we came back around of baby steps. Let's start with joining choir at the public school, commit for a semester, make good grades. We'll go to a next step. Maybe we're going to get lessons to play the guitar. We'll buy the instrument. And then if that goes, then we'll get to the next step. And maybe if we see a commitment over time, we do get the $2,500 lessons, but it's not the first step. And so that was guided by a psychologist. So I do not claim to be the smartest person in these cases and working with these families, but I know when I need to consult someone who is smart enough to help us answer those questions. And I think that's just what we have to do. We're lawyers, we've got lawyer brains, and we consult our experts whenever we come across those issues to make sure we're not doing further harm and we're nurturing and supporting the way that we should.
Great, thank you. There's a lot there. Again, a question came in the chat though, so I'm going to restrain myself, and I'll read the the note here. I was struck, Judge Martinez-Jones, by your story about the caseworker who made statements such as if your mother loved you, if she had protected you, etc. I was moved by how you handled that on an individual basis. But do you have advice for us on how to address these kinds of things on a systemic level? In other words, what can be done about either that individual caseworker or even a culture where children are not listened to or believed?
Yeah, that is always the harder part, right? Systems change is never easy. I think it can look a bunch of different ways. As a judge, I'm a judicial leader, and I can do things like convene trainings and let the supervisors and the regional directors know this is something for any advocates who are going to be, any social workers from your agency that are going to be coming in my courtroom. They need to understand this. I am a trauma-informed court. I have commitments to being anti-racist. I have commitments to empowering and affirming our LGBTQ plus community. And I put that out there and say, this is the philosophy of my court. When you come in my courtroom, this is how we will behave. And so when they see that I do it as the judge, they have to learn to fall in step, because they're going to not have a good situation if they come before me and they are not aligned with the philosophies and the goals that we have set out as the court. Now, if your judge isn't the judicial leader, I think you have to come together as a community of advocates, right? So if I wasn't that kind of judge, but my lawyers and my CASAs, all of my advocates, they got together and said, we want to be trauma informed. We're going to share a language. We're going to do anti-racist work. And all the cases that were presented before me are speaking a language that I don't quite get, and they're working in a way that I'm seeing is different. I'm going to want to get aligned and figure out what the heck people are talking about when they come in my courtroom. And so that's another way in which our advocates can come together to, I want to say encourage, but to demand that the system aligns the way of their belief. And I know child welfare systems look different across different states. And in Texas, it's a statewide agency, and we're huge. We're a huge system. And every single community is different. We have regions within our state that are very, very different. And so what works in my community doesn't work on the other side of Texas, but we are all one state agency. So what I do have to do is come together with my advocates, and we say, in this community, state of Texas, this is how we handle cases. And it's different. And they do have to align. And you can come talk to the people at our state office, and they know my community, Travis County, which is where Austin, Texas is seated, is very different than the entire state. And we just do things differently. And it's a well-known thing in our state, almost comical. But that's what we have to do. We demand what we want in our communities, whether it comes from the bench or it comes from the community.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the question. Yeah, I think I live in Denver, but I think I've seen t-shirts that say "Keep Austin Weird" or something like that. So yeah. You guys do have a reputation.
A little bit.
Yeah. So I have just a couple of other questions, and then we can wrap it up if you want. I don't want to keep you all day. I know you've been generous with your time already. In some outside conversations you and I have had, you mentioned that there's a bit of an emerging crisis, or maybe more than that, in your state. Can you talk a little bit about what that crisis looks like, in particular, its impact on older youth, and then more specifically, how those of us who are dealing with similar crises might use this method? I'm going to call it a method, although I'm not sure that's the right word, this method or approach of listening to believe to try to I mean, it's not, I'm sure not a one size fits all kind of solution, but try to resolve some of these crises by in part applying this method.
Yeah. So right now in the state of Texas, we have a few things that have been going on. We've had this federal lawsuit that I know other states have experienced about the rights of children in care, and that's been going on since 2015. I don't know if other states handled it the way Texas did, but it started off with being very non-compliant and not doing the things that were ordered. And so that culminated with a lot of things, including our pandemic, including a severe winter freeze that Texas experienced in February, just a lot of different dynamics that have resulted in a time this year where we have had more kids than ever sleeping at the agency offices. We haven't had enough placements for our kids, and these are our teenagers. The teenagers who are dual status, both in juvenile justice and child welfare, are teens who have the history of running away or psychiatric hospitalizations. You know, the ones that have the most needs, who should be in the most stable of environments, we haven't been providing that. And so for me, especially this year, it has become even more critically important that I'm listening to these kids and believing what they tell me is going on. I've had kids in offices telling me about things that are going on there, about not being treated right, being treated unfairly, even being treated in a discriminatory fashion. I've had to start investigations through our civil rights unit with the state. We've had to move kids into spaces that really were not made for kids to be there, but all constantly trying to make sure that I am doing the best that I can with what I have in this not great system at all, this broken system. And it's been really tough. It's all I can do, though, to let our kids know that, you know, the ones especially who there isn't parents to send them home to, right? Some of my kids who are in permanent care, that they're not forgotten, that they're not throwaway kids, and that they are very important. I have about 2 agency offices that are close to where I am, and I started spending each Monday after work going to the offices and checking in on them and tell me what's going on. I've done things from fixing Wi-Fi hotspots to making sure that, you know, our agency knows what's going on in individual places about not having hot meals or not having hot water. And those are crazy things to be happening to kids who are in the care of the state. But I think that if I didn't go and say, how are you doing? What do you need? How are things right now? That they may not be addressed. And so I know that sometimes the agency doesn't like that I pop up at their offices to check on the kids, but it's needed and it's necessary. And this is to just assure that they have their basic needs being met and their rights being intact, not being violated any further. And so, you know, we're in that space right now where it's hard to think of anything innovative where you're kind of like trying to put out the fires, but it is now more than ever that it's more critical that we are doing things differently, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. And now we've gotten ourselves into this perfect storm where we're just in a horrible space. So we have no choice, but we've got to do it differently. And so that's one of the things that we're really dealing with now. I know a lot of states have been dealing with things like that as well. The pandemic has not helped, especially when it comes to placements and foster homes and therapeutic environments for our kids.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap this up. But before I do, are there any other questions that folks would like to ask? You can ask over the line, or
I have one.
Go ahead, Amy.
Hello, Judge.
Hello.
So, and in full disclosure, I'm in Texas, so I get to work with Judge Martinez-Jones, and it's been a joy. But something you said about the language you use, how do you spread to have one consistent language and message? How do you spread that to all the different parties? One of the things that I heard at a youth speak is she had been out of care for 6 years, but she still referred to herself as, in Texas, we have level of care, and it was intensive. And so she identified as, I am categorized as this. So how do you kind of, in your court, spread this uniform language that you talked about?
Well, you know, I think about that shared language, and it's one of those, you know, pillars of being trauma informed. And so one thing, just really practically, constantly bringing training, constantly doing my best to make it free or low cost for all advocates. I'll do things like clear off a docket day and say, instead of docket, I need you guys here to hear about this, to learn about this. And one of those things about sharing a language, you got to spend time together and you've got to meet and you've got to work on things. I have at a time ordered the team to meet and talk about a specific issue. I will order it regularly. It's gotten to the point where I no longer have to order it, that they know, well, if we don't go meet and talk about this, then judge is just going to order us to go meet and talk about this. So let's just go ahead and do it. But then I've got to use it myself. So, I also run a specialty family drug treatment court, right? And when we talk about like removing stigma and we're wanting to use more supportive language, I know it's really hard. And in the recovery world, there's a lot of that, right? So we don't want to talk about drug tests as being positive or negative or dirty or clean. But I talk about them in my court as showing substances detected or not showing substances detected. I'm not talking about an addict. I'm talking a person with a substance use disorder. I'm talking about, things in a way where we're not continuing to stigmatize. It's hard. It takes practice, but you got to keep it up and you got to use it with consistency and people will pick up on the trend. Same in the domestic violence world. We're not talking about victims and perpetrators. We're talking about survivors and the person who used violence. It's a lot of nuance to the language, but when you put it all together and you use it consistently, it changes the culture. It changes the experience of the families who are impacted. And again, we're talking about people moving through an experience. And I talked about that perceived justice, and that's the way that you get at that.
Thanks, Amy. What other questions do folks have? Okay, so I'll just ask one more, Judge, if that's all right, and then we'll wrap it up. And my question's a real practical question. So you have a number of court improvement program directors and staff and attorneys and judges on the line right now. I'm going to ask you a question from a court improvement program director or staff's perspective. What can I do tomorrow? What's my first step as a CIP director or staff to start to implement or apply or use this method in my own work as a CIP director?
Well, I'm gonna say two things because I think there's two really important things. When we're talking about on the practical case by case level, I think stopping, I talked about, I took a pause. I'm checking myself. And just when we talk about like equity work, I stop and check my bias. I stop and check all kinds of thoughts that may be going through my head before I maybe say the next thing or decide the next step to take. And I say, get comfortable with doing that. Get comfortable with taking a pause, taking a moment to think, and whatever it is you need to do in that moment. Consider one of those being, should I just believe what I'm hearing right now? So some of those other things may be, am I checking all of my bias? Like kids don't really know what they're talking about, or they're not really that smart, or they don't really understand the system. Those kinds of things are what we stop and take a pause for. And one of those things can be on your list. Can I just listen and believe? What's the worst that will happen if I just believe this? And I think that's a practical, I'm getting ready to step back into this work and do that. But if we're talking about improving our courts, right? And I'm talking about improving an experience, one of the things I realized that even in my community, we're not doing very good is being informed by the people that we serve, which is why I'm trying to do that more on an individual basis. But we need the people who have the lived experience to guide and inform our systems change. So if we want to shift the culture and we want to change the system, we shouldn't just continue to prescribe what we think it needs to be. So if I'm talking from people who may know how to align funding with a court who needs a thing that may improve that process, let's talk about how we convene these groups. I'm currently working on convening an advisory group to advise me, the judge, the court, on my innovations and my culture shifts and the practices that we do in my court. Before I implement them, let me have a people who have lived experience, who can tell me whether they were former foster youth, parent, family member who's been caring for kids. Tell me your experience, your truth about how the system impacted you, and how you could have judge do something better for you, or attorney or CASA. And then let's use that to inform our decisions. Just like we're data driven often, and we've gotten very good about talking about that, let's be informed by those with lived experience in systems change as well. And so that would be the kind of bigger scope concept I would submit to our program folks who could help us with that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. You got the gears spinning, and that's a gift, actually. I appreciate you giving me that. I got to tell you, I think I need my own advisory group too, just in life in general. Although I think my wife thinks she is my advisory group, and she might be, but that's a brilliant idea. So, well, Judge, thank you very, very much. I mean, I'm honored to have you here. I know we all are. And thank you for the message that you've shared with us and your commitment to the bench and to justice as a whole. I'll hang on for just a couple more minutes, Judge. I know that your time is precious. If you want to hang on for a minute or two, you can, but we'll wrap it up here. Again, thank you. Everyone else, have a good rest of your week. I'm going to Hawaii on Friday, so I expect to have a very good week, especially next week. And we'll see you at our next CIP talk. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having me.